What happens when a bride leaves her multimillionaire groom standing at the altar? This isn't just any runaway bride story. It's a tale of love, heartbreak, and an unexpected twist that will leave you speechless. He had everything: money, power, a beautiful fiancée. But on his wedding day, she disappeared without a trace. What drove her away, and how did he respond? The answer will surprise you, as it takes this story in a direction no one saw coming. Get ready for an emotional journey where true love, second chances, and shocking decisions redefine everything you thought you knew. The day had started like a dream, sunlight pouring through the grand stained glass windows of the cathedral, music echoing softly across the vaulted ceilings, and hundreds of guests seated waiting in anticipation. The elaborate floral arrangements, towering above the pews, filled the air with the sweet scent of roses and lilies, setting the perfect scene for a fair. Alexander Donovan, the multimillionaire groom, stood at the altar, his heart pounding not with nerves but with excitement. He looked dashing in his tailored tuxedo, his usually serious expression softened by the emotions of the day. This was it, the day he had been waiting for. He was ready to begin a new chapter with the love of his life, Emily. Emily had always been the one who could break through Alexander's tough exterior. She had this warmth about her, an effortless grace that made people gravitate toward her. She wasn't dazzled by Alexander's wealth or his success. She saw him for who he truly was. And that was what made him fall for her. They had met through mutual friends years ago, and slowly but surely, she had become an integral part of his life, someone he couldn't imagine living without. But as the minutes turned into hours, a sense of unease began to settle over the crowd. The whispers started as small murmurs like the rustling of leaves in the wind, growing louder with each passing moment. Alexander's smile began to falter as he glanced at his watch. Emily was late. Very late. The priest shifted uncomfortably, and the guests exchanged confused glances. The bridesmaids, dressed in beautiful lilac gowns, huddled together, their expressions worried. Alexander tried to remain calm, but his heart was pounding for a different reason now. Something felt wrong. He could feel it deep in his gut, an unsettling feeling that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He turned to his best man, his longtime friend Lucas, who gave him an uncertain smile, shrugging his shoulders as if to say, "Maybe it's just nerves." But Alexander knew. Emily wasn't the type to be late, especially not today. Minutes turned into what felt like hours, and finally Alexander couldn't wait any longer. He stepped away from the altar, ignoring the bewildered looks from the guests, and headed towards the back of the cathedral. He needed answers. He needed to see her, to know what was happening. His heart pounded in his chest as he pushed open the door to the bridal suite, hoping to find her there, getting ready, maybe just needing a moment alone. But the room was empty. The bouquet she was supposed to carry lay abandoned on the vanity, the petals beginning to wilt. Her dress hung neatly on the rack, untouched. Panic surged through Alexander, his mind racing with questions. Where was she? What had happened? He pulled out his phone, dialing her number, his hands trembling. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. Each unanswered ring felt like a punch to his gut, the realization sinking in slowly but painfully. Emily was gone. Lucas appeared at the door, his face pale. "Alex," he said, his voice low. "She's not here. No one has seen her. It looks like she's gone." Alexander felt the world tilt beneath him, his vision blurring as he tried to make sense of what Lucas was saying. Gone. It didn't make sense. She wouldn't just leave. Not without saying something, not without a reason. He stumbled back, his hand gripping the edge of the vanity to steady himself. The whispers from the cathedral seemed to grow louder, the walls closing in on him as he tried to comprehend what was happening. The hours that followed were a blur. The guests were informed, their confused and pitying glances making Alexander's chest tighten painfully. He could barely hear their words of sympathy, their offers of help. It was all noise, a cacophony of sound that only made the emptiness he felt more profound. He had everything planned. The perfect day, the perfect life. But it had all come crashing down in an instant. The woman he loved had disappeared, leaving behind nothing but questions and a heartache that felt unbearable. Alexander returned to his penthouse that night, the silence of the empty rooms almost suffocating. The wedding decorations, the champagne, the music, it all felt like a cruel joke now, a reminder of what should have been. He sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had always been a man of action, someone who faced challenges head-on. But this was something he couldn't fix. He couldn't just throw money at the problem or find a solution with a snap of his fingers. Emily was gone and he didn't know why. The next few days were agonizing. Alexander reached out to her friends, her family, anyone who might have a clue about where she had gone. But no one knew anything. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. There were no signs, no hints, nothing that could explain why she had left. He replayed every conversation, every moment they had shared, trying to find something, anything, that might explain her sudden disappearance. But all he found were memories of laughter, of love, of promises made. There was no warning, no sign that she was unhappy, and that was what hurt the most. Alexander's world had always been one of control. He controlled his business, his image, his future. But now, he was faced with something he had no control over, something he couldn't understand or change. He was lost, drifting through the days without purpose, without direction. He missed her laughter, her warmth, the way she made everything feel right. And the thought that he might never see her again, that he might never get the chance to understand why she had left, was almost too much to bear. But then, something shifted. Maybe it was the sleepless nights, the endless questions that had no answers. Or maybe it was the realization that he couldn't keep living like this, broken and lost. Alexander knew he had a choice to make. He could let this destroy him, or he could find a way to move forward. He could try to understand, to find closure, even if it meant facing the painful truth of why she had left. Alexander decided to do what he did best. He took action. He hired a private investigator, someone who could help him find the answers he so desperately needed. He wasn't looking to force Emily back into his life. He just needed to know why. He needed to understand what had gone wrong, what had made her run. He needed to hear it from her, even if it broke his heart all over again. Weeks passed, and slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. The investigator traced Emily's steps, following leads that led to a small coastal town miles away from the city. It was there, in a modest cottage by the sea, that Alexander finally found her. She looked different, her hair shorter, her clothes simple, her face free of the makeup she used to wear. But she was still Emily, the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman who had left him standing at the altar with nothing but questions and a broken heart. Alexander stood at a distance, watching as she walked along the beach, her bare feet sinking into the sand, her eyes fixed on the horizon. He felt his heart clench in his chest, a mix of emotions swirling inside him: relief, anger, sadness. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but now that he was here, he didn't know what to say, how to approach her. All he knew was that he needed to understand, to hear her side of the story. Taking a deep breath, Alexander stepped forward, his feet crunching softly against the sand. Emily turned at the sound, her eyes widening in shock as she saw him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the distance between them filled with all the words that had been left unsaid. Then, slowly, Alexander took another step, his voice barely a whisper as he said, "Emily." Tears filled her eyes as she looked at him, her lips trembling as she tried to find her voice. "Alex," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of pain and regret. "What are you doing here?" Alexander's heart ached at the sight of her tears, his own eyes stinging as he took another step closer. "I had to find you," he said, his voice breaking. "I had to know why. Why did you leave?" Emily looked away, her eyes filled with guilt as she hugged her arms around herself. I didn't know how to tell you," she said, her voice barely audible. "I love you, Alex. I always have. But I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready for the life you wanted. for the expectations, the pressure. I felt like I was losing myself, like I was becoming someone I wasn't. And I couldn't do it. Not then. Not like that. Alexander felt his heart break all over again at her words, the pain raw and deep. But there was also something else. A sense of understanding, of clarity. He had always been so focused on what he wanted, on the life he had planned, that he hadn't stopped to consider what Emily needed, what she was feeling. He had been so sure that their love was enough, that everything else would fall into place. But love wasn't about control or plans. It was about understanding, about compromise, about giving each other the space to grow. Slowly, Alexander nodded, his eyes meeting hers. "I understand," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "I wish you had told me. I wish I could have helped you, been there for you. But I understand now. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry for not seeing it sooner." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, her heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. She took a step forward, her hand reaching out to touch his. "I never stopped loving you," she whispered. "I just needed time. Time to find myself again." Alexander's heart swelled with love and hope as he looked at her, his fingers closing around hers. "Then let's start over," he said, his voice trembling. "No pressure, no expectations, just us. Whatever that means, whatever that looks like. I just want you, Emily. I always have." Tears spilled down Emily's cheeks as she nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and love. "Okay," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Let's start over." And there, on that quiet beach with the waves crashing gently against the shore, Alexander and Emily found each other again. It wasn't the perfect ending they had once imagined, but it was real, and it was theirs. And as they stood there, holding each other, they knew that they had been given a second chance, a chance to build something new, something stronger, something that was truly theirs. The decision to start over wasn't as simple as it sounded. Alexander and Emily were determined, but the reality of reconciling was far more challenging than either of them had anticipated. It required honesty, vulnerability, and above all, patience. Virtues that Alexander had never truly cultivated before. He had always been the type of man to take charge, to find solutions swiftly and move forward. But rebuilding a relationship with Emily meant moving at a different pace, and that was something new for him. He had to learn to let go of the need to be in control, to let things unfold naturally. When Alexander returned to the city to take care of his affairs, Emily stayed behind in the small coastal town, finding comfort in the quietness that surrounded her. She needed this time alone to re-establish herself, to understand who she was and what she wanted without the influence of wealth and grandeur that had previously surrounded her life with Alexander. Her days were simple and she cherished them, working at the little bookstore, befriending her neighbors, and taking long walks by the sea. For the first time in years, Emily felt like she was truly living for herself, without any external pressures shaping her decisions. Alexander, meanwhile, worked tirelessly to wrap up his former life. He sold his penthouse, downsized his assets, and began to question all the things he had once prioritized. Each step was a small but significant move towards a new life, a life that wasn't defined by his money or power, but by the love he had for Emily. Letting go of the material comforts and symbols of status he had accumulated over the years wasn't easy, but he found solace in the fact that each action brought him closer to the simple life Emily was building. The thought of being with her again, in a setting where they could both be free from the burdens of his past, gave him the strength to move forward. After weeks apart, Alexander finally returned to the coastal town. He had imagined a joyful reunion, embracing Emily, feeling that sense of completeness that only she could give him. But the reality was different. There was hesitation between them, an unspoken tension that lingered in the air. They both had wounds that needed time to heal, and though they were ready to be together, they had to face the challenges of understanding who they were now, after everything that had happened. They decided to take things slow. Instead of making grand plans or looking too far ahead, They chose to live day by day, savoring the little moments, cooking dinner together, watching the sunset from Emily's porch, talking late into the night. They rediscovered each other in those quiet hours, peeling back the layers that had formed over time. It wasn't always easy. There were times when the scars of the past seemed too deep, when the fear of losing each other again cast a shadow over the moments of happiness. But they were determined to make it work, one step at a time. Emily spoke of her fears, her doubts about the life she had once been thrust into. She confessed that being in the spotlight, surrounded by luxury, had made her feel like an imposter. It had never been her dream. It had always been Alexander's. And as much as she loved him, she couldn't lose herself to become someone she wasn't. She spoke of how overwhelmed she had felt, how she had slowly begun to lose her sense of identity, and how the pressure of it all had finally driven her to run. Alexander listened, truly listened in a way he never had before. Her words stung, but they also opened his eyes to the truth he had ignored. He had thought he was giving Emily the world, but in reality he had been trying to fit her into his world, without considering if that was what she wanted. He realized that he had been so focused on the future, he envisioned that he had forgotten to consider Emily's happiness in the present. It was a hard truth to swallow, but it was necessary for their growth. One particular evening, as they walked along the beach under a sky painted in hues of orange and pink, Alexander stopped and turned to Emily. "I want you to know," he said, his voice soft but resolute, "that I don't expect anything from you. Not the life we had before, not the plans I once made. I just want to be with you, however you need me to be. I want to build a life with you that's ours, not just mine." Emily looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "That's all I've ever wanted, Alex," she whispered. She reached out, her fingers intertwining with his. In that moment, they both knew it wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. The simplicity of their connection, free from the expectations and demands of their past, felt like a fresh start, one they both desperately needed. Days turned into weeks, and slowly the uncertainty began to fade. They grew more comfortable, more confident in the love they shared. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of frustration, times when the shadows of their past loomed over them. But each time, they chose to face those challenges together. Alexander learned to let go of the need to fix everything, to simply be there for Emily, to let her set the pace. He learned that love wasn't about having all the answers, but about being present, even when things felt uncertain. One afternoon, they decided to take a drive along the coastal roads. The salty breeze filled the car, and the radio played soft tunes as they drove with no particular destination in mind. They stumbled upon a quaint little cafe nestled on a hill overlooking the sea, its charm irresistible. They stopped for lunch, and as they sat there savoring the food and the view, Emily suddenly looked at Alexander with a spark in her eyes. "Wouldn't it be wonderful to have a place like this?" she said, her voice filled with a kind of excitement Alexander hadn't seen in a long time. A little cafe, something simple and beautiful. Alexander's heart swelled at her words. It wasn't just the idea that moved him, but the fact that Emily was ready to dream again, ready to build something with him. He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "I think that sounds perfect," he said, his voice filled with love. In the following days, the idea of starting a cafe began to take shape. They discussed it endlessly. Where it could be, how they would decorate it, what kind of food they would serve. For Alexander, it was a completely new territory. He was used to boardrooms and high-stakes decisions, not planning menus or arranging flowers in a cozy cafe. But he loved every moment of it because it was something they were building together. It wasn't about making profits or expanding empires. It was about creating something meaningful, something that reflected their journey. But despite the peace they had found, there were still unanswered questions. Questions that lingered in Alexander's mind. He wondered if there would come a day when Emily would regret walking away from the life they once had, or if he would ever be able to fully let go of the man he used to be. There was still a part of him that feared losing her again, that doubted whether he was truly enough for her now that he was no longer the multimillionaire with the world at his feet. Emily sensed his fears, and one evening as they sat watching the stars, she took his hand and held it tightly. "Alex, I don't need the life we had before," she said softly. "I need you, just you. And as long as I have that, I have everything I need." Her words were a balm to his aching heart, a reassurance that gave him the strength to believe in what they were building. It was in that moment that Alexander finally let go of his fears, of his insecurities, of the past that had held them back for so long. He knew, without a doubt, that this love was real, and it was worth every sacrifice, every compromise. One weekend, Alexander surprised Emily by renting a small rustic cabin in the mountains. It was simple, with no luxuries, just a fireplace, a cozy bed, and a view of the stars. Emily's eyes lit up as she looked around, her smile wide and genuine. "This is perfect," she said, her voice filled with emotion. Alexander wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I wanted to give you something real," he whispered. "Something that's just about us." Emily turned in his arms, her eyes meeting his. "This is all I need," she said softly. "You, me, and the love we share." As they stood there, holding each other in the quiet of the mountains, Alexander realized that this was what he had been searching for all along. Not the grand gestures, not the lavish displays of wealth, but the simple, honest love that he shared with Emily. It was a love that had been tested, a love that had grown stronger through the challenges they had faced. And as he looked into Emily's eyes, he knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Their journey was far from over, but as they stood there, their fingers entwined and their hearts full, Alexander and Emily knew they were ready for whatever came next. They had found each other again, not in the grand halls of a cathedral or in the midst of a lavish life, but in the quiet simplicity of love, the kind of love that was true, unwavering, and theirs alone. After months of finding their rhythm together in the coastal town, Alexander and Emily had begun to feel a sense of stability. Their love had grown deeper, built on a foundation of understanding, vulnerability, and patience. They were preparing to open the little cafe they had dreamed about, an intimate space with rustic charm, filled with warm colors and the aroma of fresh coffee and pastries. It was a venture that was uniquely theirs, a symbol of their journey and the life they were building together. But just as they were beginning to settle into this new phase, an unexpected figure reappeared, someone from Alexander's old life, a man named Victor Reynolds. Victor was an old business partner, someone who had once been part of Alexander's world when wealth, power, and high stakes were the norm. Victor arrived at the cafe unannounced, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from one of tranquility to tension. Alexander had not seen Victor in years. He was surprised by the visit, but he welcomed Victor into the cafe, offering him a seat. As they exchanged pleasantries, Victor's sharp gaze swept over the modest surroundings, a faint smile on his lips that seemed more like a smirk. He leaned in, his voice low and almost conspiratorial. "Alexander, my old friend," Victor said, his tone dripping with a mix of nostalgia and arrogance. "I never thought I'd find you here living this quiet little life. You were always meant for more, weren't you? I have a business proposal, an opportunity that could put you back on top." Alexander stiffened, his jaw clenching. He could feel Emily's eyes on him from behind the counter, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. He knew what Victor represented: temptation, the allure of the life he had left behind, the chance to regain the power and prestige that had once defined him. Victor laid out his proposal, an investment opportunity that promised massive returns, a chance to be part of a major deal that was already attracting the attention of powerful players. Alexander listened quietly, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. Part of him felt the pull, the temptation to return to the world he once ruled. It would be so easy, one decision, one step back into that familiar arena, and he could have it all again. The power, the influence, the wealth. It was like a ghost from his past, whispering in his ear, reminding him of who he used to be. But then his gaze drifted to Emily. She was wiping down the counter, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment. There was love in her eyes, a quiet strength that had become his anchor. He had promised her a new life, one without the pressures and expectations that had driven them apart before. He had promised her simplicity, honesty, and love, and yet here he was, facing the temptation to break that promise for the sake of something that no longer held real value to him. Victor's voice pulled him back to the present. Think about it, Alexander. You could be on top of the world again. This little cafe is charming, sure, but is this really where you see yourself? Is this really enough for you? Victor's words hung in the air, a challenge that seemed to question everything Alexander had worked for in the past few months. Alexander took a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists beneath the table. He felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him, one choice that could change everything. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, and looked Victor straight in the eye. "Thank you for the offer, Victor," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I've moved on from that life. I'm building something different now, something real. I appreciate you coming all this way, but I'm not interested." Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback. He hadn't expected Alexander to refuse so easily. He gave a short laugh, shaking his head. "You've changed, Alexander, but I suppose that's what love does to people. If you ever change your mind, you know where to find me." With that, Victor stood, his smirk still in place as he extended his hand. Alexander shook it, feeling a sense of finality as he watched Victor leave the cafe. The door closed behind Victor and the tension seemed to dissipate. Alexander let out a long breath, his shoulders relaxing as he turned to Emily. She was standing there, her eyes filled with questions, her expression unreadable. He walked over to her, his heart pounding as he tried to find the words to explain. "Who was that?" Emily asked, her voice soft but tinged with worry. "An old business partner," Alexander replied, his eyes meeting hers. "He wanted me to join him in some big deal, something that could have put me back in the life I used to live." Emily studied his face, her brow furrowed. "And what did you say?" Alexander reached for her hands, holding them gently as he spoke. "I said no. Because none of that matters to me anymore. What matters is right here. This cafe, this life, you. I won't let anything jeopardize what we have, Emily." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes and she smiled, a mixture of relief and love shining in her gaze. She stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him. "I was scared," she admitted, her voice muffled against his chest. "I was scared that maybe you'd want to go back, that I'd lose you again." Alexander held her tightly, his heart aching at the thought. "You won't lose me," he whispered, his voice filled with conviction. "I'm not going anywhere. I chose you, Emily. I choose us every single day." The tension that had filled the cafe slowly melted away, replaced by a sense of peace. This was the turning point, Alexander's chance to prove, not just to Emily but to himself, that the life they were building was what truly mattered to him. He had faced the temptation, the pull of his past, and he had chosen love. He had chosen Emily, and the quiet, simple life they had carved out together. In the days that followed, Alexander and Emily grew even closer. The incident with Victor had brought them face to face with their greatest fears. Emily's fear of losing Alexander to his old life, and Alexander's fear of not being enough without his wealth and power. But facing those fears had also brought clarity. They were reminded of why they had chosen each other, why they had walked away from the lives they used to lead. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, the stars twinkling above them, Emily turned to Alexander, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm proud of you," she said, her eyes shining. "I know it wasn't easy, turning down that opportunity. But you did it for us, and that means everything to me." Alexander smiled, his heart swelling with love for her. He reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "It was an easy choice," he said softly, "because I've already got everything I need right here." Emily leaned her head on his shoulder, a contented sigh escaping her lips. They sat there in silence, the night air cool around them, the sound of the waves crashing in the distance. They knew that there would be more challenges ahead, more moments of doubt, more tests of their love. But they also knew that they were ready to face them together, stronger now than they had ever been before. For Alexander, the moment with Victor had been a turning point, a chance to prove to himself that the man he had become was far more valuable than the man he used to be. He had built his empire, amassed wealth and power, but none of it had brought him the happiness he found in the simple moments with Emily. And as he held her close, he knew that this was the life he wanted, the life he had chosen. No amount of money or success could ever compare to the love he had found, the love he was determined to hold on to for the rest of his life. The decision to stay with Emily and build the simple life they had dreamed about was not just a commitment. It was a turning point that signaled a deep transformation for Alexander. In the weeks that followed, he found himself more at peace than he had been in years. He realized that the power he once wielded, the wealth he had accumulated, all felt hollow compared to the genuine happiness he found in the small cafe he and Emily were creating together. There was a sense of purpose now, one that wasn't driven by profits or accolades but by love and connection. Every day Alexander worked side by side with Emily, renovating the cafe and preparing it for their grand opening. It was hard work, the kind of labor he was not used to. His hands grew calloused from painting walls, fixing shelves, and moving furniture, but he didn't mind. In fact, it made him feel more grounded, more connected to the life he was building. Each coat of paint, each carefully selected piece of decor was a testament to their shared vision. Emily, too, flourished during this time. She had always loved simple joys, and now, with Alexander at her side, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The cafe wasn't just a business. It was a sanctuary for both of them, a place that reflected the values they had fought so hard to hold on to. Emily worked on creating a menu that was welcoming and homey, filled with the comfort foods she knew their future customers would love. She wanted the cafe to be a place where people felt at home, a place where they could take a break from the chaos of life and just be. They spent evenings on the porch, often tired from the day's work, but filled with a sense of accomplishment. They talked about their plans for the cafe, the kinds of people they hoped to welcome, the laughter and warmth they hoped would fill the space. Emily would often rest her head on Alexander's shoulder, her eyes closing as she listened to his ideas. For her, it was these moments, the quiet ones filled with dreams and laughter, that made all the sacrifices worthwhile. Yet, despite their growing contentment, they both knew that life would not always be this simple. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Alexander turned to Emily, his brow furrowed. "Do you think we'll always be able to keep this?" he asked quietly. "This peace, this happiness?" Emily looked up at him, her eyes gentle and filled with understanding. "Life will always have its ups and downs, Alex. There will be challenges, moments that test us. But as long as we face them together, I believe we can hold on to this." She reached out, taking his hand. "We just have to remember why we chose this life, and hold on to that." Her words stayed with Alexander, giving him a sense of reassurance that he had never experienced before. He had always been afraid of vulnerability, of the possibility of losing control. But with Emily, he realized that being vulnerable wasn't a weakness, it was a strength. It was in those moments of uncertainty, of raw honesty, that their love grew even stronger. The day finally came when they were ready to open the cafe. It was a modest event with friends from the town and a few curious passers-by who had watched the place take shape over the past months. Alexander and Emily worked together seamlessly, serving coffee, pastries, and sharing stories with the guests. The air was filled with laughter and the clinking of cups, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the scent of the sea breeze that drifted in through the open windows. Alexander found himself behind the counter, taking orders and preparing drinks. It was a far cry from the boardrooms and high-powered meetings he was used to, but he loved every moment of it. He loved seeing the smiles on people's faces, loved the sense of community that was forming within the walls of their little cafe. He looked over at Emily, who was chatting with a customer, her face lit up with joy, and felt his heart swell. This was what true success felt like. Not the wealth, not the accolades, but the simple joy of creating something meaningful with the person he loved. But the journey to this point had not been without its challenges. A few days after the opening, they faced their first major hurdle. The old plumbing system in the cafe suddenly failed, flooding part of the kitchen and causing significant damage. Alexander felt a familiar sense of panic rise within him, the urge to fix everything immediately, to throw money at the problem until it disappeared. But this time, he took a breath. He remembered Emily's words, that they would face the challenges together. He looked at her, and instead of panic, he found determination in her eyes. Together, they tackled the issue. They called in a plumber, worked late into the night to clean up the mess, and found a way to keep the cafe running despite the setback. It was exhausting, and there were moments when the stress almost got the better of them. But through it all, they supported each other, never losing sight of what they were building. One night after the plumbing issue had been resolved, Alexander and Emily sat on the floor of the cafe, surrounded by tools and cleaning supplies. They were exhausted, their clothes dirty, and their muscles aching, but there was a sense of satisfaction between them, a sense that they could handle whatever came their way. Alexander looked at Emily, her face smudged with dirt, her hair pulled back messily, and he felt a rush of love for her that took his breath away. "I couldn't do this without you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You make me want to be better, to face things I never thought I could." Emily smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. She reached out, cupping his face in her hands. "And you make me feel like I'm never alone," she whispered, "that no matter what happens, we'll always have each other." They leaned in, their foreheads touching, and for a moment, the world around them disappeared. It was just the two of them, sitting on the floor of their little cafe, surrounded by the mess and chaos of life. And in that moment, they knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be. Their relationship continued to grow, not in grand gestures or sweeping romantic moments, but in the quiet, everyday acts of love and support. They learned to navigate the challenges together, to find joy in the small victories, and to lean on each other when things got tough. Alexander no longer felt the need to prove himself through wealth or power. He had found a deeper sense of purpose in the life he was building with Emily, a life that was rich in love and connection, and in the simple joys of everyday moments. Emily, too, found herself changing. She felt stronger, more confident, knowing that she had a partner who truly understood her, who respected her need for independence and simplicity. She had once feared that being with Alexander meant losing herself, but now she realized that their love allowed her to be more herself than she had ever been before. One afternoon, as they were closing up the cafe, a young couple walked in. They looked nervous, holding hands tightly as they approached the counter. Emily greeted them warmly, and they hesitated before speaking. The woman explained that they were planning to get married but were struggling to find a place that felt right for their small, intimate ceremony. They had heard about the cafe and wondered if it might be possible to rent it for their wedding. Alexander and Emily exchanged a look, a smile spreading across their faces. They knew exactly what it felt like to search for a place that felt right, a place that reflected the love they shared. Without hesitation, they agreed, and over the next few weeks, they worked tirelessly to prepare the cafe for the couple's special day. The day of the wedding arrived, and as the young couple exchanged vows in the cozy cafe, surrounded by flowers and the warmth of their loved ones, Alexander and Emily stood in the back, holding hands. It was a reminder of their own journey, of the love they had fought for and the life they had built together. As the ceremony ended, Emily looked up at Alexander, her eyes filled with tears. "We did this," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. "We created something beautiful, something that brings people together." Alexander nodded, his heart swelling with pride and love. "Yes, we did," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, "And I wouldn't want to do it with anyone else." In that moment, surrounded by the love and joy of the young couple and their families, Alexander and Emily knew that they had found something far more valuable than any wealth or power. They had found a life filled with purpose, with love, and with the promise of endless possibilities. And as they stood there holding each other close, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, hand in hand, just as they always had. The cafe had become a cornerstone of their community, a gathering place where people came to relax, share stories, and connect. Alexander and Emily had poured their hearts into every detail, and their efforts had not gone unnoticed. The cafe was thriving, and the life they had built together felt stronger than ever. But as their lives seemed to settle into a rhythm of happiness and peace, a shadow from Alexander's past emerged, threatening to unravel everything they had fought so hard to achieve. It started with a letter, an elegantly embossed envelope delivered to the cafe one quiet afternoon. Alexander picked it up from the counter, the sight of his name written in familiar cursive handwriting sending a chill down his spine. He recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from Victor Reynolds. Alexander hesitated before opening it, his instincts screaming that whatever lay inside that envelope would bring trouble. But he couldn't ignore it. He slipped the letter opener through the seal and pulled out a crisp sheet of paper. The words were brief, but unmistakably threatening. Victor wanted a meeting, and he wasn't asking. He was demanding. It seemed that Victor had taken Alexander's previous refusal as a challenge, a rejection that needed to be corrected. As Alexander read through the letter, he felt the weight of his past pressing down on him, the familiar feelings of control and powerlessness washing over him. Victor's letter was clear. Either Alexander showed up to discuss business, or there would be consequences. Victor had always been the type to hold a grudge, and Alexander knew that refusing him once again would not go without repercussions. Emily found Alexander sitting in the kitchen of the cafe, the letter clenched in his hands, his face pale. She approached him cautiously, sensing that something was wrong. "Alex? What is it?" she asked, her voice gentle but filled with concern. Alexander looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and anger. He handed her the letter, watching as she read the words, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. She looked at him, her brow furrowed. "What does he want?" "He wants me back," Alexander said, his voice filled with frustration. "He thinks he can pull me back into that world, that I'll just fall in line because he's threatening me." Emily sat down across from him, her eyes searching his face. "What are you going to do?" Alexander took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he rubbed his face. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't want to go back, Emily. I don't want anything to do with that life. But Victor, he's dangerous. If I refuse, he could hurt us. He could hurt you." Emily reached out, placing her hand over his. "We'll face this together, Alex. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out. You don't have to go back to that life. We'll find another way." Alexander looked at her, the love and determination in her eyes giving him a sense of strength. He nodded, his heart heavy, but resolute. He wasn't going to let Victor control him, and he wasn't going to let anyone threaten the life he had built with Emily. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to fight for the life they had created, no matter what it took. A week later, Alexander received another letter. This time it wasn't a request, it was a demand. Victor had given him an ultimatum. Show up for a meeting, or Victor would make sure the cafe faced legal issues, inspections, and anything else he could use to make their lives difficult. Victor knew how to play dirty, and Alexander knew that this was just the beginning if he didn't comply. Emily and Alexander spent sleepless nights discussing their options. They knew that giving in to Victor would mean opening a door they had closed for good reason. It would mean stepping back into a world of greed, power, and manipulation, a world that had nearly cost them everything. But ignoring Victor's threats could put everything they loved at risk. They were trapped between two impossible choices. Then, one evening, as they sat together on the porch, Emily took Alexander's hand, her eyes filled with determination. "We're not going to let him win," she said, her voice steady. "We've fought too hard for this, Alex. We're not going to let him take it away." Alexander looked at her, his heart swelling with love and admiration. He had always been the one to take action, to protect. But now it was Emily who was leading the charge, her strength and resolve guiding him forward. He nodded, his jaw set with determination. "You're right," he said. "We're not backing down." Together, they decided to confront Victor, not in the way he expected, but on their own terms. They contacted a lawyer, someone who could help them navigate the legal threats Victor had made. They gathered evidence of Victor's past activities, his manipulations, and the threats he had made. They were going to fight back, not with violence or power plays, but with the truth. The confrontation came sooner than they expected. Victor showed up at the cafe one afternoon, his presence sending a ripple of unease through the customers. He walked in, his eyes locking onto Alexander, a smug smile on his face. "I thought I made myself clear, Alexander," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You don't get to walk away from this." Alexander stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "And I thought I made myself clear, Victor. I'm done with that life. You can't intimidate me anymore." Victor's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk away? You think you can defy me without consequences?" Emily stepped forward then, her voice steady as she spoke. "We're not afraid of you, Victor. And we're not alone. We have the law on our side and we have each other. Whatever you're planning, it won't work." Victor's eyes flicked to Emily, a sneer curling his lips. "You think you can stop me with your little cafe and your empty threats? You're in over your heads." But Alexander stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that this was the moment that would determine whether they could truly move forward, free from the shadows of his past. He took a deep breath, his voice unwavering as he spoke. "We're not in over our heads, Victor. We've already contacted the authorities. They know about your threats, your past. You're the one who's in over your head." For a moment there was silence. The tension in the cafe was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. Victor's expression darkened, his confidence faltering as he realized that Alexander wasn't bluffing. He took a step back, his eyes narrowing as he glared at Alexander and Emily. "This isn't over," Victor said, his voice low and menacing. "You'll regret this." But Alexander didn't flinch. He watched as Victor turned and walked out of the cafe, the door slamming shut behind him. The tension slowly began to dissipate, the murmurs of the customers filling the space as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Alexander turned to Emily, his heart pounding, his hands trembling. She stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him, her voice soft as she whispered, "You did it, Alex. You stood up to him. We stood up to him." Alexander held her tightly, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He had faced his past, faced the man who had once held power over him, and he had refused to be controlled. It was a victory, not just for him, but for the life he and Emily had built together. In the days that followed, Alexander and Emily worked with their lawyer to ensure that Victor's threats would no longer be a danger to them. They filed restraining orders, gathered evidence, and made sure that they were protected. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the fear crept back in, when the uncertainty threatened to overwhelm them. But they faced it together, each step bringing them closer to the freedom they had fought so hard to achieve. The cafe continued to thrive, the community rallying around them in support. People who had witnessed the confrontation came back, offering words of encouragement and admiration. They weren't just running a business. They were part of something bigger, something that brought people together, that inspired others to stand up for what mattered. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Alexander and Emily sat on the porch, their fingers intertwined. The air was filled with the scent of the sea, the sound of waves crashing against the shore. Alexander looked at Emily, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. "We did it," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "We faced him and we came out stronger." Emily smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "We did," she whispered, "because we have each other, and as long as we do, nothing can take this away from us." Alexander leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her lips. In that moment, he knew that the life they had built, the love they shared, the simple joys they found in each other, was worth every battle, every challenge. They had faced the worst of his past, and they had come out on the other side, stronger and more in love than ever. The climax was not just about standing up to Victor. It was about reclaiming their lives, about proving that love, determination, and the courage to change were stronger than any threat. And as they sat there watching the stars appear in the night sky, Alexander and Emily knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, hand in hand, their hearts forever intertwined. The storm had passed, and with it came a renewed sense of purpose for Alexander and Emily. They had faced Victor, overcome his threats, and emerged victorious, not because they had the power or the wealth to fight him, but because they had each other and the courage to stand up for what they believed in. It had been a turning point, one that solidified the foundation of their love and the life they were building together. The cafe continued to thrive, becoming not just a business, but a home away from home for many in the community. Word of their story had spread, and people came not just for the coffee and pastries, but for the warmth and love that radiated from every corner of the cozy space. Alexander and Emily poured their hearts into every aspect of the cafe, and it showed. It was a place of laughter, of connection, a place where people felt safe and welcome. As weeks turned into months, the cafe grew into something truly special. It hosted book readings, community gatherings, and small, intimate weddings. Alexander and Emily had turned it into a place where people could celebrate life's simple joys, and in doing so, they found themselves more fulfilled than they had ever been. It wasn't the life Alexander had once imagined for himself, but it was the life he had come to cherish, the life he couldn't imagine living without. One day, as they were closing up the cafe, a woman approached the counter. She was older, her face lined with years of experience, her eyes kind. She introduced herself as Margaret, a local journalist who had heard about their story. She asked if she could write an article about them, about their journey, their love, and the cafe that had become a symbol of hope for so many. Alexander hesitated at first. He had always been a private person, and the idea of sharing their story with the world made him uneasy. But as he looked at Emily, standing beside him, her eyes filled with pride and love, he realized that their story was worth sharing. It was a story of resilience, of love overcoming adversity, of choosing to build a life that truly mattered. And if their story could inspire even one person to find the courage to follow their heart, then it was worth it. The article was published a few weeks later, and the response was overwhelming. People from all over reached out, sharing their own stories of love and struggle, of the challenges they had faced and the lives they had built. The cafe became busier than ever, and Alexander and Emily found themselves surrounded by a community that was not just supportive but genuinely invested in their happiness. One quiet evening, after the last customer had left and the cafe was bathed in the soft glow of the string lights that hung from the ceiling, Alexander and Emily sat together at a table, their fingers intertwined. They looked around at the space they had created, the space that had become so much more than they ever could have imagined. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "From that day at the altar to now, it feels like a lifetime ago." Alexander smiled, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "It does," he said softly. "Sometimes I can't believe we made it through all of that. But I wouldn't change a thing. Every challenge, every heartbreak, it all led us here. To this moment." Emily looked at him, her eyes shining with love. "I wouldn't change a thing either," she whispered. "This is exactly where I want to be." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant crash of waves from the shore. Alexander felt a sense of peace settle over him, a contentment that he had never known before. He had spent so much of his life chasing success, striving for more, always looking for the next big thing. But now he realized that true success wasn't about money or power. It was about love, about the people you chose to share your life with, about creating something meaningful together. The cafe had become more than just a business. It was a testament to their love, to the journey they had taken together. It was a place where they had poured their hearts and souls, and in return, It had given them a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. They had faced their fears, confronted their pasts, and come out stronger on the other side. And as they sat there, in the quiet of the cafe they had built together, they knew that this was just the beginning of the life they wanted to create. A few weeks later, Alexander received a call from an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to since his days in the corporate world. The friend had read the article about the cafe and wanted to congratulate Alexander on everything he had accomplished. He also wanted to make a proposal, an offer to invest in the cafe, to help expand it, to turn it into a chain that could reach more people. Alexander listened, his heart pounding as memories of his old life flashed through his mind. The offer was tempting, a chance to grow, to expand, to turn their small cafe into something bigger. But as he looked at Emily standing behind the counter, her face lit up with a smile as she chatted with a customer, he knew what his answer would be. He politely declined, thanking his friend for the offer, but explaining that the cafe was meant to be something simple, something intimate. It wasn't about growth or profit. It was about the love and connection they had built within those walls, and he wasn't willing to risk losing that for anything. When he hung up the phone, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had made the right choice, and as he walked over to Emily, wrapping his arms around her from behind, he knew that this was the life he had always wanted. A life filled with love, with purpose, with the quiet joy of simple moments shared with the person he loved most. Emily turned in his arms, her eyes meeting his. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice curious. Alexander smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Just an old friend," he said softly, "someone who wanted to help expand the cafe. But I told him no. I don't want more. I just want this. You, me, and the life we've built together." Emily's eyes filled with tears, her heart swelling with love for the man standing before her. She reached up, cupping his face in her hands. "I love you, Alex," she whispered, "more than anything." Alexander leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a gentle kiss. "I love you too," he whispered, "and I always will." As they stood there, holding each other in the quiet of the cafe, they knew that they had found something truly special, something that money could never buy, something that no amount of success could ever replace. They had found love, in its purest and most beautiful form, and as they looked out at the cafe, at the space they had created together, they knew that this was just the beginning of the life they wanted to build, one filled with love, with purpose, and with the simple joys that made every moment worth living. Alexander and Emily had faced their pasts, confronted their fears, and built a life that was theirs alone. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, hand in hand, their hearts forever intertwined. It wasn't the grand, perfect ending they had once imagined, but it was real, and it was theirs, and that, they knew, was more than enough. Years had passed, and life in the little coastal town had settled into a beautiful rhythm for Alexander and Emily. Their cafe had grown to be a beloved landmark, an essential part of the community. It wasn't just a place to grab a cup of coffee, it was a place where memories were made, where people came to find warmth, connection, and comfort. The couple had put their heart and soul into making it more than just a business. They had made it into a symbol of love, resilience, and hope. The cafe was bustling as usual, filled with people of all ages. The soft chime of the entrance bell rang out as customers came in and out, greeted by the scent of freshly baked pastries and the rich aroma of brewing coffee. There was always an air of friendliness, of familiarity, with patrons greeting one another like old friends. Alexander would be at the counter working alongside Emily, who seemed to move with an effortless grace, chatting with customers as she prepared their orders. The regulars knew them by name, and they always had a kind word to say or a warm smile to offer. It had taken years of hard work, but every moment had been worth it. Alexander had found his calling, one he never could have imagined in his old life. He had traded boardroom meetings and high-stakes deals for mornings spent baking bread and afternoons spent greeting neighbors, and it had brought him a kind of happiness he never knew he needed. He was no longer the cold businessman who kept everyone at arm's length. He was part of this community, connected to these people, and he cherished every moment of it. Emily, too, had found her place, her joy. She had always loved the little things in life. The warmth of the sun on her skin, the laughter of children, the sight of someone's eyes lighting up when they tasted something she had made. The cafe allowed her to live in those little moments, to be surrounded by people who appreciated the simple joys of life. She had taken on a leadership role in the community as well, organizing events at the cafe and partnering with local charities to support those in need. It brought her great fulfillment to know she was making a difference, however small, in the lives of others. Their children had grown, and they visited often, bringing with them the next generation. Alexander and Emily's grandchildren filled the cafe with laughter and energy, their innocent joy infectious. On weekends, the children would run through the cafe, giggling as they played games with each other, while Alexander watched with a smile, his heart full. He loved telling them stories, tales of adventure and love, always weaving in lessons about courage, kindness, and the importance of family. The children would listen with wide eyes, captivated by their grandfather's storytelling, and Emily would smile as she watched them, her heart swelling with love for the family they had created. There was a particular afternoon, one that stood out vividly in Alexander's mind. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange. The cafe was closed for the day, but it was filled with friends and family, people who had come to celebrate a special milestone. The cafe was marking its 10th anniversary, and Alexander and Emily wanted to share that moment with the people who had been a part of their journey. Emily stood at the counter, her eyes glistening as she looked out at the familiar faces. She raised a glass of lemonade, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "I just want to say thank you," she began, her gaze shifting to Alexander. "To all of you who have supported us, who have made this dream a reality. And to Alexander, my partner, my love, thank you for always believing in us, for never giving up, even when things were hard." Alexander felt his throat tighten with emotion as he looked at Emily, the love of his life. He raised his own glass, his voice steady but full of feeling. "This cafe, this community, it means everything to us, and it wouldn't have been possible without all of you, and especially without Emily. She's the heart of this place, the one who brought warmth and love into my life. I love you, Emily. Here's to many more years together." The room erupted in cheers, glasses clinking as people toasted to the couple who had touched so many lives. Laughter filled the air, and Alexander felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond words. They had built something beautiful, something lasting, and it was more than he had ever dreamed of. As the years continued to pass, the cafe became even more of a landmark in the community. People came from far and wide, having heard the story of Alexander and Emily, the couple who had given up a life of luxury to create something meaningful. Their story had been shared in newspapers, on social media, and even in a small documentary that a local filmmaker had made about their journey. People came not just for the coffee, but for the story behind it, for the love that was infused into every corner of the space. The young couple who had once asked to get married at the cafe returned one day with their own children, wanting to show them the place where their parents had started their journey together. Alexander and Emily welcomed them with open arms, their hearts swelling with pride as they saw the legacy they had created. It wasn't about the cafe itself. It was about the lives they had touched, the love they had shared, and the way they had chosen to live their lives. Alexander and Emily had also traveled in those years. They had always dreamed of seeing the world together, and as their children grew older and took on more responsibility at the cafe, they found the time to do just that. They visited small villages in Italy, explored bustling markets in Morocco, walked through fields of lavender in France, and stood in awe before the northern lights in Norway. But no matter where they went, they always found themselves drawn back to the small coastal town they called home. It was where their hearts belonged, where they had built a life that was rich not in wealth, but in love and connection. The cafe became a place of tradition, a spot where anniversaries were celebrated, where first dates took place, where friends gathered to share their joys and their sorrows. Alexander and Emily were always there, welcoming everyone with open arms. Their love for each other a shining example of what was possible when you chose to follow your heart. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their home, the sun dipping below the horizon, Emily turned to Alexander, her eyes filled with love. "We've lived a good life, haven't we?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. He took her hand in his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "The best life," he said softly, "and it's all because of you." Emily smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "I wouldn't have it any other way," she whispered. They sat there in silence for a moment, watching the stars appear in the night sky. The air was filled with the sound of the waves crashing against the shore, the distant laughter of their grandchildren playing in the yard. It was a moment of pure contentment, a moment that encapsulated everything they had fought for, everything they had built together. Their story was one of resilience, of love that had been tested but had never wavered. They had faced challenges, endured heartbreak, but they had always chosen each other. And in that choice, they had found a love that was true, a love that was enduring. They had built a life that was filled with meaning, with purpose, and they knew that their journey was far from over. As the stars twinkled above them, Alexander leaned over, pressing a gentle kiss to Emily's forehead. "No matter what comes next, we'll face it together," he whispered. Emily nodded, her heart full. "Always," she said softly, and as they sat there wrapped in each other's arms, they knew that they had found something truly special, something that no amount of wealth or success could ever replace. They had found love in its purest and most beautiful form, and they had built a life that was rich beyond measure. And that, they knew, was more than enough. The cafe, their home, their family, it was all a testament to the choices they had made, to the love they had shared. And as the years continued to pass, they knew that their story would live on, not just in the walls of the cafe, but in the hearts of everyone who had been touched by their journey. It was a story of love, of hope, of choosing to live life on your own terms. And it was a story that they knew would continue to inspire, long after they were gone. The night grew darker, the stars shining brightly above, and Alexander and Emily sat there hand in hand, their hearts forever intertwined. They had come a long way from the people they had once been, and they had built something beautiful, something lasting. And as they looked out at the world around them, they knew that they were exactly where they were meant to be, together, forever.